Hi, and welcome to Open, the show that opens the Bronx and the rest of the world to you. I'm Kibin Alleyne. Throughout this year, we've diligently kept you, our viewers, informed about current events, politics, health, wellness, and much more in 2023. In this edition of Open Best of 2023, we will revisit some impactful segments. So stay tuned with us because we're now officially opened. Hello, everyone. I'm Kibin Alleyne, and today is Tuesday, January 2nd. You are now watching Open, a program that brings the Bronx and New York City straight to you. Don't forget to stay connected with us via social media at BronxNet TV. We hope you all enjoyed your holiday, and we are excited to start a wonderful new year with you all. To celebrate the new year here on Open, we will take a look back at some of our favorite segments of 2023. For our first segment, we look at this interview with Izzy Ramirez, a writer for Vox Future Perfect section, where we discuss an article that examined the issue of racism as part of a broader discussion on discrimination. The article highlights the pervasive discrimination Black people in America face in all aspects of their lives. Let's take a look. What was the inspiration behind exploring anti-Black racism and discrimination in the way it looks for Black people in America?
Right. So Vox had this awesome collaboration with an all-Black newsroom, Capital B, and we really were looking at, a lot of follow-up from what has happened with George Floyd. All of these discussions have been mounting for so long, and we really wanted to look at all the different facets of discrimination, whether it's health discrimination, monetary discrimination, all of these sorts of different ways that discrimination can impact your life. And that was kind of like the impetus behind it. But for our piece specifically, we'd been in touch with researchers at the University of Chicago, and they had accrued like this insane body of work, about 50 years of studies, around like 40 plus studies that looked at all of the different ways that discrimination is really pervasive for Black communities. And we, dug through and wrote the piece.
Now, I'm really glad you mentioned that there was so much study that goes behind it, because in the article you talked about how it's a challenge to call out discrimination and how it's sometimes hard to prove. Can you expand on that idea and how finding this research helped, with writing this article?
Yeah, so the big thing that we really wanted to focus on is, discrimination is hard to prove in the sense that you never really know what's in someone else's brain when it happens to you. Like, let's say, you're up for a promotion and you didn't get it. It's kind of hard to say, oh, it's discrimination, right?
Mm-hmm.
Unless it's, obviously very blatant, aggressively in your face, which,
Right.
Not very fun. And, Black and brown folks, this is something that we know deeply, intrinsically, but there's the benefit of having the evidence, since there's oddly this debate about whether or not it is discrimination, which I find really fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Where most academics are no, this is we have all of these studies, it's proven time and time again, whether it's through correspondence studies or different types of study work. But that was kind of the big thing about the piece, was just discrimination can be hidden. And a lot of the folks that I spoke to for it were just sharing their stories with me. I talked to maybe 16 folks. Not everyone made it into the piece, but they were just I will never know. And it is driving me up the wall that I will never know.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, I really want to touch on the fact that you mentioned George Floyd earlier. I was very surprised that even after George Floyd, there were people that were still maybe in denial about the presence of discrimination. It seemed like after that moment happened in our history, we were moving forward, or people were starting to understand. Can you just talk about that moment when you realized there are people who still don't believe that this is really happening?
Yeah, so a lot of it can be in certain either academic circles, policy circles, where there is a lot of, what they like to call confounding factors. Can we really say it's anti-Black discrimination? What if it's income? What if it's geography? What if it's XYZ? And all of these studies, like they were conducted in like all sorts of parts of America, right? Like there was one study that even used like cell phone pings for like to look at voting and like how long it would take for folks to vote depending on where you live, if it was like an all black community, et cetera. And like they found that no, like if you're living in a predominantly black area, like you will be waiting longer to vote. And the piece was really about time, right? Like that was kind of the like the thing that we really wanted to focus on, because like a lot of folks will like mention like income or all these other facets, and time is really hidden. It's insidious, like the time that you lose because of like a 15-minute weight loss, or like someone wasting your time in other arenas, like at a restaurant. That's less time with your family, that's less time for work, that's less time
Right.
doing the things that you care about, and that like adds up, considering that like black folks have a like less life expectancy than white folks.
Right. And I like that you mentioned that. I thought it was a very interesting way to address this, because we've seen so many articles talking about racism and discrimination, but I've never seen it kind of highlighted in this way in regard to time. Now, we've done segments exploring racism and discrimination in healthcare, home buying. Can you talk about how this plays out in much smaller everyday situations, such as like getting an Uber, or like you mentioned, just waiting in line? Can you expand on that
Yeah.
a little bit more?
That was like the thing that we really, like Sean and I really wanted to hone in on, because like you've probably seen those like viral studies where it's like, okay, like if you were going to get your house appraised for like a mortgage, and you were to like swap out the photos in your house from like a black family to a white family, same exact house, just different pictures, your house would get appraised more, right? And like so we'd seen these pieces and we're like, okay, what can we add to the conversation that hasn't really been addressed that much before? And so we really wanted to focus in on smaller acts of discrimination. That's not to say that like the impact isn't
Right.
negative or as harmful, but just like these little moments where like, as you said, like the Uber voting lines, there were some studies around like whether or not someone will help you cross the street, which that's a blink, like 7 blinks, right? Like not a lot of time, but like over the course of your life, those little things are cumulative, and that's kind of what we wanted to address in the piece, like things that like you might brush aside. One of the sources that we spoke to was just like there's a defense mechanism, like you can't spend all of your energy
Right.
worrying about it, because you'll drive yourself up the wall.
Right.
But at the same time, like you are losing like time in your life.
Right. I love that you mentioned that, because sometimes I'll go to the doctor and I'm like, this is taking way too long. Like, I'm like, I'm just here to get my teeth cleaned, and like, if my appointment's at 3:30, I'm not getting seen until 5:30. And like you mentioned, you don't want to say like, is it because of the area that I live in? Is it because everybody, tends to look a certain way? But I mean, it's really great that there is like research to support this. Can you talk a little bit more about the research that was conducted that provided proof that people it just wasn't in their head, like they
Yeah.
actually are experiencing what they think they're experiencing?
Yeah, so the folks at UC were incredible. They'd actually been in contact with Vox for like, I think a year, sending us all of these like data. And Sean was really like the big brain, like calculus guy when it came to like sifting through the studies. But like what we were looking at was just very much like, what can we tell via charts? What can we, support through our like anecdotes and the story of the folks that we talked to? And what are like some of the most like surprising studies, because again, like there's like the resume study where like if you have like the same these are called correspondence studies, right? Like you have like the same exact resume, but like the names are different.
Right.
And you look at response rates. There are some studies that we looked at that were specific for finding housing, which like the rental market one I thought was really interesting, because again, like most folks see stuff for like buying houses, but we're in New York City. I don't know who owns a house.
Right.
So like, rental market stuff. There was some stuff around, I'm trying to remember, whether or not a professor would email you back or like fast enough if you were a prospective PhD student. So if you don't know, like in order to like get into a PhD program, you kind of have to like link up with like a professor who would kind of take you under your wing. But that's something that not a lot of folks know to do.
Right.
And so like the fact that like if you're trying to like get into a PhD program, again, like if you think about it, that's like income, that's a life change, that's generational wealth. will professor respond to you in time, right? So that was kind of the studies that we were looking at. And obviously, like, you can't really compare apples to oranges. They're all conducted in different ways, different sample sizes, but we really enjoyed, like, having such a trove to look at, because that can be really hard to have access to such, like, high quality data.
Now, you mentioned New York City, and that got me thinking. I know a lot of times people feel so grateful to live in New York City because there's so many different types of people here, and you feel as though, like, okay, well, at least I'm not experiencing maybe racism that someone in maybe another area that isn't as diverse is experiencing. But is it still here? Like, should people still feel like, okay, just because it's New York City doesn't mean that you're not experiencing these things?
Yeah, I mean, like, we didn't get into this too much in the piece just because the studies were, across the nation.
Right.
But yeah, I would say that, discrimination is insidious. Like, I don't know how much you can keep your eye out, just because, again, like, it is hard to know. Right. But, I think it is something to, like, think about, like, as you're conducting your own life and, like, advocating for other people. Like, a woman that I spoke to, Keisha Orr, she's the lead of the piece. She was one of these women who were, like, at the front lines at, like, in Wall Street, like, breaking barriers, and she had to advocate for a young man who who she thought was the best candidate by far, but at the time, like, hiring managers were like, well, he doesn't have a degree yet, so we can't give him the job. But the job didn't require a degree, so she, like, really put herself out in line, and it was exhausting for her. It was really, really exhausting, and she worried about him a lot even after he was hired. But the man went on to have, like, an excellent career, and I mean, I think that's all that we can really do is just, like, support one another, and keep an eye out for these moments.
Now, I want to talk about, because we talked about the time in the article, you use the term artificially short. We have about a minute left. Can you just quickly tell us, like, what that means and, how that was the theme of this entire article?
Yeah, I mean, like, if you look at the data, like, the time that we have on Earth, like, is not that long, but it's even shorter for Black and brown folks, because of the intergenerational, like, trauma and racism and discrimination that we've experienced, right? And, like, it continues to happen, but it doesn't need to. Like, we don't need to be doing this. Right. It is artificially short in the sense that this is all stuff that is preventable. We can do something about it. We don't need to be making life worse for other people for reasons that are very dumb and, like, not helpful for anyone. So I think that's kind of, like, the sentiment of the piece is, like, we're losing time. It hurts individuals, but it also hurts society. Like, we're losing out on so many great ideas, so many great people and experiences because we're just wasting time.
Right. Well, I totally appreciate you coming here and having this conversation. Like I said, I've never seen, racism be viewed at or explored in this type of way. I thought it was very new, and it was just, like, really interesting to read and to be like, I think I know what you're talking about here. So I appreciate you taking the time to come with us and talk about this.
Well, thank you for having me.
Of course. If you would like to read the article that Izzy and Sean wrote, please go to www.vox.com.
I want to thank Izzy for joining us. I enjoyed this interview because the writers of the article explored systemic racism and discrimination in a way that is not often discussed and provided some validity to the very real covert experiences with racism many people have encountered. Don't go away, we'll be back with more Open after this.
I remember when the Bronx did not really have a media outlet properly representing the people of the Bronx.
BronxNet provides for the community by being a community where people can be empowered to share their voices.
We are in a really great place technologically. We've got all the resources that we need to be effective.
Whether it's through cameras, storytelling, editing, we have provided those services for 30 years.
BronxNet's mission is to be a voice for the community.
To educate, to inform, and to inspire.
And you can be a part of it. We've built studios for you.
Welcome back. We'll now revisit this segment highlighting the organization Osborne and their LGBTQIA services. Senior health educator and community liaison for Osborne's LGBTQIA program, Grace Tetravara, joined me to discuss management services to LGBTQ New Yorkers who are involved in criminal legal issues or at risk of being involved. Let's take a look.
Now, can you talk about the overall mission of the organization Osborne?
Well, I will just stay on this part right here, that they transform lives. And it's usually those individuals, families, and communities that are affected by our criminal justice system throughout since 1933.
Now, what is the LGBTQIA case management program?
It is a program where we actually guide, lead, and assist and do lots of referrals for those who are affected by the criminal justice system who just so happen to be LGBTQIA. It's not new work. It's not even work where it requires a lot of education at certain levels. At the level in which I've had the privilege to do, I've been able to use my own lived experience as a person with a criminal justice, background. In that time, I've been able to, through the services that Osborne provided, to be able to come back as an employee and do those things. And boy, has it been not only productive, it has brought a new understanding that we've been there the whole time. And what I mean by that, we is LGBT and definitely our trans individuals.
I think that's so amazing. I love to hear stories where people is like, an organization that helped you like eventually, joined the organization and was able to give back. Can you just explain why that was so important for you to kind of
It was so important. It is so important because a lot of times when you're in those spaces of incarceration or you're a detainee or you're just dealing with supporting family, a lot of times shame comes with that. There is no open society or open discussion on transitioning for whatever status that you are with when it comes to corrections or reentry.
Now, why was it important to have a dedicated program to assist with the challenges members of this community face? And, what could be some unique challenges that may be important to focus on?
One of the great things that has always been inspiring for anyone who does this work, whether they're LGBTQIA or just a human being, is that when you bring things of names like transition and recovery and treatment, people actually know that there are levels to this. There are some, like myself, who for years languished in all type of things when it came to my health, when it came to just general services that I needed to live. A lot of times, this community in particular, we're no different than anyone else. However, due to shame and stigma and that already comes with dealing with the criminal justice system, and then you add on what some perceive as another problem, which I've never really took kind to, but that is one's gender identity. Once that is at least given an opportunity to come to the table, and you see it as just another humane issue that needs to be dealt with.
Now, you talked about the stigma a bit, and I think it's important to focus on that because although we do have these programs that are meant to help people, eventually you still have to go outside of the program and deal with other people. What do you think could be done in regards to addressing that stigma, and what could we do to kind of put an end to it?
Well, I'm never going to be so detached, to use a word like end it. We are a minority in a community, in a society, in a world where our numbers don't match the majority. So I always say to those who do this work of reentry, understand that individuals like myself, trans individuals, and of course, the mainstays, people of color and Latinos, they're always going to be a part of the correctional system, unfortunately. However, I'm about normalizing and not continuing the stigma by default. And what do I mean by default is that putting one's gender in front of the situation. It's already obvious that when a person shows up or they disclose what their gender identity is. Let's move that to the side, not out of the way, but deal with the issues that are in front of you. What are in front of you? I was uneducated. I'm educated today. I had a previous incarceration issue. I had a homeless issue. I never dealt with health issues and things like that. Today, you will find that when you go to any of these programs that do similar work, but specifically Osborne, we're not inventing the wheel here. We are just not inventing the wheel. However, people need to see someone like me because a lot of times the stigma also comes with we have to go outside of this community to get to help this community. And that is just not true. I just believe that, like most of us believe, is that when you have a living, breathing person who has come from something and lives up to the word transition, it all helps everyone.
Now, according to LGBTQmap.org, people from the LGBTQ community are frequently targeted and vulnerable to criminalization and abuse by law enforcement. Can you just tell me more about this occurrence and, how it's affecting people from this community?
Well, this is not new. Again, like most police issues, they come with a history. The history when it came to most, and I'm going to start off by saying trans people. Let's deal with that. When it's always appeared to be a conversation about trans people and the police, it always either had to do with sex work, loitering, socializing publicly, and it being criminalized. When you actually, as a community, or you are the police, or you are even community watch, or you're just a neighbor, and this is how you view that community, you need to see a face. You need to see someone who does represent that to give you another level of that. We could talk till we're blue in the face of what we should do, but one thing that we know in this city is that when you actually able to show and tell, it becomes a new conversation.
Now, I want to talk about some of the services that your organization does. How does your organization help, people just address issues of discrimination in and outside of the court?
Well, let's keep with our mission statement. We are an organization that transforms lives, families, and communities. When you bring up those other issues of other categories, whether they're political or regional, I'm just going to say this, that we're no different than anyone else. However, let's not be unrealistic that their main goal there is to transition people from one thing to another. I'm sure those things are always addressed as we go toward that. But specifically, I would never say on this show, or any show for that matter, about the policies or the ideas in which Osborne may have right now. I know that when it comes to freedom and transitioning, it comes for and with the LGBTQIA community.
And can you talk about self-advocacy? I know there's training for that. Why is self-advocacy so important? And it's something that people should learn how to do.
Because it's a classic fabric of this country here. When we look at every issue, from women issues to people of color issues, to whatever issues, mobilization always starts off with a conversation. And then you get those people who can advocate that and get it out to the community in which you seek, in which you just also maybe want them to hear what you have to say with proof and receipts and ideas. So that's how I just would think that I would answer that.
Now, in addition to legal services, the program offers healthcare, employment services, and peer support. And I was so glad to hear peer support because I think it's so important to have help. Like, of course, it's important that the people, could help you. But to have a peer help you, I think is so important. So can you just talk a little bit more about that effort?
Well, shout out to my peers. I want to give that out because peer goes not only for this agency. I believe that most agencies that do reentry work, you can't live without us. How are we going to be able to say that we are transforming lives if you only have people there who are of executive teams or those logistical things? You've got to have that. And it's been so great for me because, as I've said, I was a former incarcerated trans woman, went to an agency called Osborne Association, took those programs, no different than anyone else who comes in contact. I just happen to be LGBTQIA affiliated, and I'm also a Black trans woman. Me saying that empowers those who are maybe still doing criminal history and want to come out, and they know my story, quite documented. I'm always everywhere running my mouth. But the whole thing that is inspiring to an agency like Osborne and such a vast many services is that every department always needs our peers and our mentors, and we're no different. It's just that please understand that doing this work regarding the LGBTQIA and such vast agencies is important, but we've been there the whole time. We were there the whole time.
Now, what are the requirements to be eligible for these services? So if someone's watching, how do they know that this program may be the right fit for them?
Well, first of all, you can go to Osborne online. You can go to Grace Detrevera on Facebook. You can go to you can email me, and that is my first initial and my last name at osborneny.org. Or you can give us all a call at 929-239-5902 and start from there, because we've got to do like everything is. You have to first have that conversation.
Now, what are some goals that you hope to achieve in the future in regards to the work that you're doing right now?
Well, I'm achieving it now because doing this work, going around nationally and especially regionally in my Bronx, boogie down Bronx, people listen to realism. And it's not on a piece of paper all the time. You need that paper.
Right.
However, it's more inclusional and more tolerant, and it moves away from tolerance to it becomes ordinary and common. And we ain't there yet, but that is the idea.
Well, Grace, I want to thank you so much for joining us and having this conversation.
Thank you.
To keep up with Osborne, please follow them on social media at Osborne Association.
Here on Open, we aim to highlight the disparities facing several marginalized communities, and we appreciate when organizations come on the show to share opportunities and resources for those in need. Don't go anywhere, we have more Open for you right after this.
19.7% of Bronxites currently experience food insecurity. Meanwhile, instead of these nice, colorful foods, this is the best food that they have access to. If this sounds like you, there are a bunch of resources to get healthy food for free or cheap. If you want to help, you might consider donating or volunteering in one of these places. Community fridges like this one are all over the city and allow New Yorkers to conveniently donate extra food to people who might need it. Go to this link and find your nearest one. Food banks and pop-up events like these provide millions of healthy meals to families in need. These organizations are distributing meals to Bronxites as we speak and are always accepting donations and volunteers.
Years of BronxNet, 4 years of Modern Odyssey, broadcasting stories that may inspire you, untold or underreported stories. BronxNet, your story is heard. Thank you for your support. Thank you for watching Modern Odyssey on BronxNet.
Welcome back. We'll now go to this segment with Front Hop data associate Allison Waddell, who joined me to discuss a study on how mold is affecting the Bronx. The study analyzed reports of mold from 2017 to July 6, 2023, and found that an increasing number of New Yorkers are calling 311 to report unsafe living conditions caused by mold. Let's take a look. Now, can you just share some more or share a little bit more about the work behind the study on mold in New York City conducted by your organization, and what was the motivation behind it?
Sure. So, as one of the city's larger rental listing platforms, we're curious about the conditions that affect tenants and their day to day lives. So, we conduct market research and produce data studies on topics like average rental prices, rodent sightings, heat complaints, and now mold complaints. With this study in particular, we were curious about how the COVID-19 pandemic and climate change have affected mold complaints year over year.
Now, and I also want to add that we spoke to your organization before, and there's just so many amazing things that I think New Yorkers should just like know about. So again, thank you so much for joining us and having this conversation. What were some of the key findings in New York City? I guess this study found over the years.
Sure. So we looked at data from 2017 through July 6th of 2023, and we found that mold complaints are increasing year over year on a citywide basis. Looking a bit more specifically at boroughs, we did find that the Bronx has the highest number of mold complaints. Now, we report our numbers with normalized data, meaning that we consider the data in terms of 10,000 renters. So with the Bronx in particular, we found that it has 112.3 complaints per 10,000 renters. Following the Bronx, we have Brooklyn, which has 55.1 complaints per 10,000 renters. And then following Brooklyn, we're looking at Manhattan, Queens, and then Staten Island with the number of complaints.
Now, what are some of the potential conditions that have caused this increasing trend?
Sure. Our team, when looking at the numbers, sees how COVID-19 and climate change have impacted mold complaints. As the city is getting warmer and more moist year over year, there are more situations where mold can grow, and then the pandemic as well has influenced that growing number.
And I'm curious to know, how did the pandemic increase this?
Sure. So when we're looking at the complaints between 2019 through 2020, we see that those complaints drop off, probably because there were fewer tenants in the city. Additionally, tenants who were here may not have wanted to call to have someone come into their apartment during a pandemic. They may have been dealing with a sick family member or were sick themselves, so there may have been more pressing circumstances. After 2020, we see complaints start to increase year over year, and we're now at the point where complaints are higher than they were pre-pandemic. As there were COVID surges, more work from home policies, we believe there were more circumstances where tenants were home to see mold and then report about it.
Now, as mentioned, the Bronx ranks as the moldiest borough of New York City, which, sadly, is not a surprise. Unfortunately, whenever we see a lot of injustices in New York City, the Bronx tends to be the highest to face these injustices. Can you just explain, what could possibly be causing the Bronx to have the highest amount of mold in the city?
Sure. So looking at the Bronx and the city overall, we find that in areas where rental prices are lower, there tend to be more complaints about mold and other 311 circumstances as well. If a tenant is paying more for rent, they're likely living in a building that has a larger management team that's probably more responsive compared to buildings with lower rents. Their landlord or management company may not be as equipped to properly respond to complaints.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because it also shows that it's more than just health, that it also has class and income that can, impact your health, which kind of goes into my next question. As I mentioned, the Bronx is the highest in everything bad and the lowest in everything good. So we know that the Bronx experiences the worst health outcomes in the city. How does this finding regarding mold contribute to these poor health outcomes from the Bronx?
Right. So our study looks at the 311 complaints for mold. So a tenant who's living in a building, they're probably seeing their mold, they're watching it grow, reporting it to their landlord or management company, and then not getting a response. That's when they complain to 311, and they still then have to wait for someone to come through and address the issue. So they're spending a decent amount of time living with mold in their apartment. And in people, younger children, those with allergies, being around a moldy environment can lead to health and respiratory issues that may have long-lasting effects as well.
Wow. Now, what are some of the Bronx neighborhoods or addresses that have shown a significant increase in mold complaints?
Sure. So we found that 4 of the top 5 addresses with the most mold complaints are in the Bronx. So the first one would be Fordham Heights, which averages over 656 complaints per year. The second neighborhood is in Brooklyn, so that's Flatbush. But then looking back at the Bronx, it's followed by University Heights, Tremont, and Belmont.
Now, can you just provide some advice for renters on how to recognize signs of mold? I'm curious to know this because I think that sometimes people, may just think, oh, it's just maybe natural dirt or, just natural
Right, right.
deterioration that happens when you've lived somewhere for a long period of time. But what are some things that people should look for to know that it's mold versus just wear and tear of just living in an apartment?
Sure. So I would say the first thing a renter can do is look online for mold guides. I know with RentHop ourselves, we have a mold guide as well. If you navigate to our blog and type in mold, you'll be able to see photos of different types of mold. More specifically, renters can look for discoloration like black, green, blue spots, maybe orange as well. And then that substance may have a slimy, fuzzy, or powdery texture. And there may also be a stale or earthy smell in an area as well.
Now, I also want to know, can we just talk a little bit more about, I guess, the inspiration behind this study? Because I think that when I first learned about this, mold in an apartment or a home was like, I guess, the last thing I would think of as an injustice in New York City. I know we talked previously about like heat and hot water, maybe rent prices and stuff like that. But, what gave your organization the idea to actually look into something like this?
Sure. I would say recently in the winter, we reported on heat complaints as well. And we do also produce a rodent study that looks at rat complaints in New York City and other popular cities across the country. And we do find that the Bronx has higher number of complaints in these studies as well. So we're curious about further exploring that to see how these data studies interact with each other to form a better picture of what's happening across New York City.
And are there any laws and regulations regarding mold? But I guess just in general, like for a lot of the complaints, a lot of them have to do with hygiene or the cleanliness of a building. Are there any laws or regulations that landlords or people living in these buildings should follow just for their safety?
Sure. So the New York City Health website does require that landlords are responsible for repairing any mold complaint situations, as well as addressing any pre-existing issues like leaky pipes that may lead to increased moisture. Landlords are responsible for these in buildings with at least 3 tenants or 3 apartments, or with buildings that have people with moderate to severe asthma.
And what are some of the challenges renters face when they, I guess, address the landlord or, make these complaints to 311? What is that process like and what do they go through when they're, trying to make a complaint?
Sure. So a renter who finds mold in their apartment first will probably document that mold. That's our recommendation as well. You can take photos, take videos, submit them to your landlord or management company. And then if the problem persists, continue to document that as well to see it persisting or changing. And then that renter, they'll wait for a response from someone in their organization. If they don't hear a response, that's when you can go and call 311 or file a complaint online as well with the HPD department. And then once you file that complaint, someone from HPD will come. They'll send a uniformed code inspector to survey the situation. And that's when they'll intervene with the landlord or management company to do things like issue fines and ultimately resolve the mold issue as well.
Now, I know mold is just one aspect of, many of the things renters in New York City face. But can you just talk about the experience? Just because there are so many challenges living in New York City, especially if you're in low income areas, what is the, I guess, success rate of like actually making, and you don't have to have the exact number, but just the general experience of like making a complaint? Because I know when it came to heat and hot water for a very long time, a lot of those complaints were ignored. So can you just talk about, I guess, just your organization and the work that you do, what you guys have found in regard to when renters make those complaints, what actually happens?
Sure. So we do look at certain addresses to see how complaints change year over year. And we do find that some buildings that had a higher amount of mold complaints have decreased this year and in 2022 as well. So it does seem that as more attention is drawn to the matter, landlords and management companies are growing more responsible and addressing the issues before they turn into 311 complaints. So that is positive change we're seeing. There are still neighborhoods and buildings that we're looking at where we see the complaints staying the same or continuing to rise, and that's what we're interested in learning more about as well.
Now, I also want to talk about just in general, having a hotter spring, a wetter summer. How is that impacting, I guess these mold complaints as well as Hurricane Ida's impact?
Yes.
I know that probably, made a difference for a lot of people. So can you just talk about, how our weather and just like, natural disasters are impacting this as well?
Sure. So to address Hurricane Ida, we did find that September of 2021 had the highest number of mold complaints out of any month between 2017 and the time we finish collecting the data. So it's very clear how the hurricanes impact. There was a ton of water coming into the city that increases mold directly. So these natural disasters, as they happen and continue to happen in the future, will have a direct impact on mold complaints in the city. And again, our study just looks at renter complaints, so we don't know how that's affecting other single family homes in the city as well. So we are seeing that as things get warmer and wetter, it's increasing mold complaints.
And then I guess in comparison, how is it during the winter? Are things better because it's colder, or are we seeing the opposite?
So we actually have a higher number of complaints in the fall and winter season. It's partially because, it gets warmer in the summer. Maybe you open your window, you have an air conditioner to help with that ventilation. But then once you're closing your windows for that colder weather, it's actually increasing the chance of maintaining that moisture in your apartment and keeping, if your heat's on, makes a warmer environment, and then you don't have the ventilation from the windows. So we do see higher complaints in the fall and winter season.
Now, I'm not sure if you can speak on this, but if you could, I think this would be very helpful. What is the process of actually getting mold out of your home? And this would be also very helpful for maybe people who don't rent, but maybe live in single family homes or two family homes. So what is that process like? And is this something safe that somebody should attempt to do?
Sure. There are some kinds of mold that may be safe for at-home removal, and you can use a store-bought cleaner and follow a guide online to help you with that removal process. Typically, if it's a smaller area, something in your bathroom that you're just scrubbing the tile grout, that's going to be a bit easier than a widespread spotting that you have that you would need assistance with.
And then for renters, what would that process be like?
That would then be where you are reporting to your building that you have the mold, so that way you can have someone in proper gear safely remove the contaminated area.
And are landlords required to, I guess, take certain actions or certain steps, when this is reported? And then also, are people allowed to stay in the home? I understand that, this could be very, I don't want to say hazardous for your health, but it could be detrimental to your health. So, should they still be in the apartment when this happens? What is that process like?
Yeah, I would say a tenant should follow, if they're getting a response from their landlord or management company, they can discuss with them how safe it is to be in the apartment themselves. Obviously, some tenants may not have the option to just leave and rent somewhere else if they're having that mold complaint, but some may have a friend or family they can stay with if they're not feeling safe in their apartment. And then landlord or management company may be able to close a building, put people up in a different living situation for the time being. Ultimately, as well, if a renter finds persistent mold issues, they're reporting a lot, it's not getting properly addressed, they can also seek legal counsel to discuss withholding rent as well. But we recommend seeking counsel before you do something like that.
Right. And I appreciate you taking the time to talk to us, because as a New Yorker, I just think these segments are so informative. We talked about your organization just a little bit,
Sure.
but can you just let everybody know a little bit more about your organization and, what they can do to actually find these type of studies?
Sure. So RentHop as a whole, we're a apartment listing platform. So you can come on our platform to look for rental listings when it's time to move. But, all those days of the year where you're not moving, you can look at our data studies and our blog to find information about topics that appeal to renters. We produce blog posts, data studies, everything just to help out the renter on the day-to-day.
Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
If you would like to read more about this report by RentHop, please go to their website, which you can find on your screen below. Or if you would like to learn more about this organization, please go to their website at www.renthop.com or follow them on social media at RentHop. I want to thank Allison for taking the time to speak with us. As we've repeatedly discussed on this show, the Bronx faces the most significant challenges when it comes to health in New York City. Therefore, revisiting this topic was crucial as it affects many New Yorkers, particularly those in the Bronx. We have to take a quick break. We will be back with more Open right after this.
Discover what's possible. BronxNet's education programs, internships, and opportunities help engage and inspire Bronx youth and beyond to pursue their passions. Be a part of the BronxNet family. Whether you're interested in our shows, joining a class, or donating to support our mission, visit bronxnet.org to learn more.
Welcome back. As we continue on the theme of health, especially as we endure these colder months, it's important to take a look back at this segment with researcher and director of rehabilitation innovation at Mount Sinai Health System, Dr. David Petrino, as we discuss the effects of long COVID and what new research reveals about this condition. Now, can you just explain for those who, may not know what it is, what is long COVID?
So long COVID is what we call an infection-associated complex chronic illness. It affects around 7% of Americans today, and that number continues to increase. The CDC describes long COVID as any condition where about 3 months after your acute COVID infection, you're still experiencing symptoms related to that infection. So it can look very different in different people, but it is affecting millions of Americans right at this moment.
And can you just explain, what are those symptoms?
So some of the most comprehensive articles that look into long COVID symptoms have identified over 200 different symptoms that can affect every organ system in the body. Some of the most common symptoms are extreme fatigue, so people being unable to get themselves up from a laid down position or, get themselves out of bed. Cognitive impairment, so things such as forgetting how to get to your house from, being down the street, or not being able to make decisions, or, things of that nature. Then we also have things like post-exertional malaise, which is an inability to be able to exert yourself without experiencing severe symptoms afterwards, and gastrointestinal issues, skin issues, you name it. If you can think of an organ system, we see issues affected by long COVID.
Now, can you talk a little bit more about the study that you participated in that examined the blood samples of individuals with long COVID?
Yeah, so recently we completed a study where we looked for biological differences between people who had a diagnosis of long COVID, individuals who had COVID and fully recovered from their acute infection, and individuals who had never had COVID. And what we were able to show was that there were very clear differences in blood biomarkers that we were studying between those three groups that allowed us to identify people with long COVID with 96% accuracy compared to the two control groups that did not have long COVID.
Now, I know it may be pretty complicated, but what were the differences that you found? And, could these, I know it's in blood, but could these differences also be seen in other ways, maybe just in symptoms or, how quickly they bounce back, stuff like that?
So certainly we encourage all clinicians right at this moment to diagnose long COVID based on symptoms. If a patient comes to you with symptoms related to an acute COVID infection, believe them, make the diagnosis, because right now that's the best tool we have, is listening to our patients. But in terms of the blood differences that we found, it is complicated. There were many different things that we saw, but I can boil it down to three big things that we saw. The first was that we saw evidence of what we call viral persistence, meaning that there was strong evidence that in folks with long COVID, the virus is still in the body. The body is still producing antibodies against the virus. The body is still responding as though the virus is present. The next thing we saw were hormonal differences. We saw extremely low levels of a hormone called cortisol, which is actually the hormone that wakes you up in the morning. When you wake up and your cortisol starts to spike, that's the thing that actually makes you able to get out of bed and get on with your day. In folks with long COVID, morning cortisol was extremely low, meaning that this hormone that ordinarily gets us ready for the day isn't working the way that it should be in their bodies. And the final thing we saw was evidence of what we call immune exhaustion. So their immune system, the folks with long COVID, their immune system was so exhausted from fighting something for a very long time that now other viruses that were within their bodies, such as Epstein-Barr virus or herpes virus, was reactivating. So if we take all of this together, what we see as different from folks with long COVID is their body has been fighting something for a long time, probably the SARS-CoV-2 virus. It's starting to get tired. So we're seeing hormone depletion, we're seeing immune depletion, and that leads to all sorts of other symptoms and reactivations and problems that are happening downstream.
Now, I understand that you describe long COVID as biological. Now, what does this mean? And, what are some of the long-term effects this will have on patients?
So it was important that we labeled long COVID as a biological illness because for many years, even before COVID, there have been infection-associated complex chronic illnesses like chronic Lyme disease or myalgic encephalomyelitis, which is sometimes called chronic fatigue syndrome. And for the longest time, people with these conditions have been dismissed as having a psychological illness. So it was very important that when we published this paper showing very clear differences in blood biomarkers that allowed us to predict with 96% accuracy who had long COVID and who did not, that we called that out as biological so that we don't continue along with this narrative of people who have these infection-associated illnesses, which are often sometimes viewed as invisible illnesses because physically folks will look okay, but their bodies can't work. We need to make sure that these folks are being, called, the conditions are being called what they are, which is biological, not psychological.
Now, how could this affect patients who are currently facing maybe other illnesses?
So individuals with long COVID come from all walks of life. So, we really actually haven't seen any specific vulnerabilities to going on to develop long COVID. I have people who, prior to their COVID infection, used to run marathons, used to do every sort of endurance sport you could think of, high-performing individuals. And I have individuals who were quite unwell before they got COVID, and they went on to develop long COVID as well. It really does seem to affect individuals indiscriminately. So what that tells us is we all need to be aware of this. We all need to be taking precautions to avoid developing long COVID.
So I guess my next question now is, what causes someone to experience long COVID? Is it something maybe people, I know you mentioned that there are people who are healthy who experience this, but are there any factors or any markers that someone could look for to know if they may experience long COVID at some point?
At present, no. At present, I wish I could say, there are folks in our community who are safer than others, but right now, what we need to focus on is infection prevention. We need to focus on clean air. We need to focus on mask wearing. We need to focus on making sure that if someone goes to a hospital, they feel safe because we've taken a lot of infection prevention measures to make sure that they don't go on to get SARS-CoV-2 infection. So that would be the biggest thing that we can do right now to prevent long COVID in our communities, is prevent getting infected in the first place.
Now, I know we're still kind of new in the research realm of studying long COVID, but if this is a biological illness, could this in some way be passed down through genetics? Let's say someone is pregnant and they have long COVID. Is it possible that they could pass it on to their child, or is there any research to determine whether that is possible or not?
It's a really great question. It's very unclear right now as to whether long COVID is something that can be passed down. I will say that the NHS in the UK, which is the National Health Service in the UK, has now made people with a diagnosis of long COVID ineligible to donate blood. That's how concerned they are about this problem, because we don't know right now if infection-associated complex chronic illnesses can be passed down. So we do need to be cautious about that.
Now, more research may be needed, but because we're seeing the long-term effect, COVID is having on patients, could there be a cure or treatment to help alleviate some of these symptoms? Or is this something that's possible now that we know people are living with this for prolonged periods of time? Could we possibly see medicine over the counter, any stuff like that to help these people that are living with long COVID?
So our center at Mount Sinai, which is called the Cohen Center for Recovery from Complex Chronic Illness, or the CORE, focuses a lot on interventions. Now, what we commonly tell our patients is that we focus on treatments, not cures, at this time. And what I mean by that is if a person with long COVID walks through our doors, we can get them quite a bit better with a different sort of cocktail of medicines and rehabilitations and other interventions. But we right now do not have a targeted cure for this illness. We are running lots of different clinical trials right now where we're repurposing drugs that are already on the market to try and see if we can make a difference in the lives of folks with long COVID. But for the time being, what we really focus on is treating the symptoms and seeing if through those treatments we can make people a little more functional and feel a little more like themselves. And that's what we've got for right now.
Now, I know there's so much going on. What could we see in the future of research in regard to long COVID? Because there's so many questions that I'm sure that so many people have, and right now we just don't have that many answers because it is something that's fairly new. So, what could the future of research look like in regard to long COVID?
I think the future of research is bright. We have a lot of really incredible people working this problem right now, and I think from my perspective, what I'm most excited about is the prospect of very sophisticated clinical trials where we try combination therapies to treat individuals with long COVID. I do not think that this is a condition that is going to have a single drug solution. I think that because of how many people are affected so differently by long COVID, we need combination therapies. We need to better understand all of the different ways that long COVID can present in different communities, because it never looks the same way twice. And we need to come up with clever ways of trialing combination drugs to make sure that we treat the problem appropriately.
Now, we are approaching, flu season and COVID season where the risk of getting sick is heightened. Can you just quickly let us know what people should be doing just to stay safe?
So all of the same old things that we've learned in the pandemic. So making sure that you're up to date with your vaccinations, making sure that you are, taking appropriate caution when you're in crowded places. So if you can wear a mask, do wear a mask. If you can set up a HEPA filter or something that's going to clean the air around you, set that up so that you've got access to clean air. These are the infection prevention things that we can do. And, I'm always going to advocate for caution around crowds, around indoor gatherings, and making sure that if you're sick, stay at home. Think about your community. Don't struggle through it and get a whole bunch of other people sick, because the reality of the science right now is that every COVID infection is a risk, and we want to make sure that people stay healthy.
Well, Doctor, I want to thank you so much for joining us and having this conversation.
Thank you.
I'd like to give a special thank you to Dr. Petrino for joining us. We've come a long way since the start of COVID-19, but as we move forward, it's imperative that we continue to take the necessary precautions to stay safe and healthy. We've come to the end of our show today. I'd like to thank you all for being with us this last year, and we look forward to another journey with you all in 2024. If you missed any part of today's show, you can catch the Recablecast at 5 and 10 p.m. on Optimum Channel 67 and Verizon Fios Channel 33, or watch anytime on the web at bronxnet.org. You can catch a brand new episode of Open with Darren Jaime on Wednesday and with Rena Valentine on Friday. I'm Kibin Alleyne, wishing you and yours safety and wellness now and always. See you next time.